The first time Kaylin Cross walked into her office, Zora Whitfield knew exactly what kind of man he was. She had met 100 of him before. Expensive suits, expensive watches, and the kind of smile that expected doors to open just because he was standing in front of them. This one didn't even knock. "Ms. Whitfield," he said her name like he already owned it. "I need a signature." Zora didn't look up from the manifest she was reviewing. Outside her window, the port of Newark churned with cranes and container ships, the low groan of machinery a constant hum beneath everything. It was 6 in the morning, and she'd already been at her desk for 2 hours. She liked it that way, quiet, before the chaos of the day started, before men like this one showed up to ruin it. "You need an appointment," she said. "I don't sign anything before I've read it." "You'll want to make an exception." Kaylin dropped a folder on her desk, sliding it across the polished wood like he was dealing cards. "Cross Fashion House. New shipment coming through your terminal next week. I just need your approval on the manifest." Zora finally looked up. He was younger than she expected. Mid-30s, dark hair combed back, eyes the color of wet slate. Handsome in the practiced way that made her instantly suspicious. Men who looked like that had never once had to work for anything, and they hated her for being the one person in the room who didn't care. She opened the folder, skimmed it. Her eyes moved fast. She'd spent 15 years in customs law and supply chain compliance, and she could smell a badly built lie before she finished the first paragraph. "This manifest lists textile imports," she said, "but your declared weight doesn't match your declared volume." "Not even close. Either your fabric is made of lead, Mr. Cross, or there's something else in these containers." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not panic, amusement. Like she'd surprised him, and he didn't get surprised often. "It's a rounding error." "It's a 40% discrepancy." She closed the folder and pushed it back toward him. "I'm not signing this. And frankly, I'm not sure who let you into this building without a visitor's badge. I own the building next door. People tend to assume I belong wherever I want to be." "Not in my office." Zora stood, smoothing down her blazer, and for the first time, she watched him actually take her in. Not with the polite, careful blankness most men wore around a woman her size, and not with the cruel little smirk she'd learned to recognize from across a room. He looked at her like he was recalculating something, like the numbers weren't adding up the way he'd expected. "You're not what I was told to expect," Kaylin said slowly. "And you're not the first man to walk in here thinking his name would do the talking for him." She gestured toward the door. "It won't work twice." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned back against the edge of her desk, arms crossed, studying her the way a man studies a puzzle he's decided he wants to solve. "You know who my family is." "I know exactly who your family is." Zora kept her voice level, though her pulse had picked up. Everyone on the East Coast shipping circuit knew the Cross name. The fashion house was the public face, glossy and legitimate, but everyone who worked the docks long enough eventually heard the whispers about what moved underneath it. Cross Enterprises didn't just import silk, which is exactly why I'm not putting my name on a single page of this. "Careful, Ms. Whitfield. That almost sounded like an accusation." "It was an observation. I don't waste time on accusations I can't prove yet." She held his gaze, refusing to let the tension in the room push her back an inch. "But I've been doing this job long enough to know a rigged shipment when I see one. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out of my office, resubmit an honest manifest, and if it checks out, I'll approve it like any other client. If it doesn't, you'll shut me out. I'll shut you down." She said it flatly, like a fact rather than a threat, and something about her certainty seemed to land harder than any warning he'd received in years. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cranes groaned outside. A forklift beeped somewhere on the dock below. Then Kaylin laughed, short, surprised, almost involuntary, and pushed off from the desk. "There's a restaurant 2 blocks from here. Best table in the house is mine every Friday night. I'd like you to join me." Zora actually laughed back, though there was no warmth in it. "You just tried to bully me into laundering a shipment for you, and now you're asking me to dinner." "I'm a man who appreciates being told no. It happens so rarely. Then let me be the exception to your whole life, Mr. Cross." She walked past him and opened her office door herself, holding it wide. "No to the dinner, no to the manifest, and no before you ask again next week." He studied her a beat longer than was comfortable, something unreadable moving behind that slate-gray gaze. Not anger, not the wounded ego she expected from men used to getting their way. Something closer to fascination. "You'll change your mind," he said, walking toward the door. "I won't." Zora held his eyes without blinking. "But you're welcome to keep wasting Friday nights finding out." He paused in the doorway, close enough that she caught the low, expensive note of his cologne, and for just a second, the practiced charm dropped away entirely, replaced by something rawer. The look of a man who had just met the first person in years who wasn't afraid of him. "I don't waste things I want, Ms. Whitfield," he said quietly. "I acquire them." Then he was gone, leaving nothing behind but the folder on her desk, and a feeling she refused to name, the unsettling certainty that this wasn't the last she'd see of Kaylin Cross. She was right. She just had no idea how wrong that would turn out to be for both of them. 4 days later, Zora was elbow-deep in a batch report when the floor manager burst into her office without knocking. "Ms. Whitfield, there's a problem downstairs." She didn't need to ask what kind of problem. She already knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky turns. By the time she reached the factory floor, Kaylin Cross was standing in the middle of her production line like he'd built it himself, flanked by 2 men in dark suits who looked wildly out of place among the spinning frames and steam presses. Workers had stopped mid-task, eyes darting between their machines and the strangers who'd walked in unannounced. "You can't be in here," Zora said, cutting straight through the noise of the machines. "I own 11% of this facility's parent holding company," Kaylin said, not even looking at her yet. He was studying a bolt of eco-fabric on the nearest loom, running it between 2 fingers, like he was pricing it. "That gives me the right to inspect my investment. 11% doesn't give you the right to walk onto my floor with armed men and no notice." Zora's voice was calm, but it carried. Every worker within 20 feet had gone quiet, listening. "This is a Class 2 textile production environment. There are safety protocols, contamination protocols. You don't get to skip them because you like to make an entrance." Now he looked at her, and there it was again, that flicker of surprise, quickly folded away behind a practiced smile. "I didn't realize dye fumes required an escort. They don't. Ignorance does." She turned to the 2 men beside him, unfazed by their size or their obvious discomfort at being spoken to by a woman half their height and twice their confidence. "Hairnets now. And those shoes," she gestured at their polished leather, "are a slipping hazard, next to industrial steam. You'll need the rubber soles from the supply closet, or you're not walking 1 more foot onto this floor." One of the bodyguards actually looked to Kaylin, as if silently asking whether this was a joke. Kaylin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Ms. Whitfield, Mr. Cross." She matched his tone exactly, refusing to be talked over. "You said you own part of this holding company. Fine. Then you already know I run compliance and safety on this floor with full authority. written into the operating agreement your own lawyers signed off on. If you'd like to fight that clause, you're welcome to take it up with legal. Until then, hairnets." For a long moment, nobody moved. The steam presses hissed. Somewhere behind them, a worker stifled a laugh and turned it into a cough. Then, to the visible shock of both bodyguards, Kalen reached into the supply bin by the door and pulled out a hairnet himself, tugging it over his dark hair with the same unbothered ease he wore his tailored suits. "There," he said. Satisfied? It should have looked ridiculous. Somehow, on him, it didn't, which annoyed Zora more than she wanted to admit. "Your men too." His bodyguards hesitated only a beat before Kalen gave a short nod, and they reluctantly complied, swapping their shoes at the supply closet under the amused stares of half the floor staff. Zora watched the whole exchange without a trace of a smile, though something in her chest had loosened slightly. Not warmth exactly. Recognition. He hadn't argued the point once he'd lost it. That was rarer than she expected from a man like him. She led them through the facility herself after that, refusing to let anyone else take the burden of managing him. She showed him the eco-dye vats, explained the water reclamation system she'd spent 2 years fighting to get funded, pointed out the low-impact fiber blends her team had developed that were now being requested by 3 luxury houses in Milan. Kalen listened more than he spoke, which surprised her almost as much as the hairnet had. "You built all this," he said finally, as they stood at the edge of the finishing line, watching bolts of pale green fabric roll off the machine in clean, even sheets. "I didn't build it alone, but yes, most of it." She crossed her arms. "Which is exactly why I won't let you or anyone else compromise it for a shipment that doesn't add up." "This isn't about the shipment." His voice had lost its earlier edge. "I wanted to see the operation myself. See if the woman who threw me out of her office 4 days ago was running something as sharp as she talked. And you're better than sharp." He turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd met him, there was no performance in his expression at all, just something quiet and unguarded, almost startled by itself. "I don't think I've met anyone who wasn't afraid of me in longer than I can remember." "Maybe that's the problem," Zora said. "Maybe everyone around you learned fear was the price of staying close. I never signed up to pay it." Something shifted in his face. Not offense, but the look of a man turning a key in a lock he hadn't realized was there. "Dinner," he said again, quieter this time, without the swagger of their first meeting. Not a negotiation. Not a bribe. Just dinner. Zora studied him a long moment, aware of every eye on the floor, still pretending not to watch them. She thought of the mismatched manifest still sitting in her desk drawer, unresolved, thought of everything the cross name implied, and everything she still didn't know. "No," she said, and meant it. "But you're welcome to keep proving me wrong about the rest of it." She walked away before he could answer, leaving him standing in a hairnet in the middle of her factory floor. And if she'd looked back, she might have caught him smiling for the first time all day, not at her rejection, but despite it. The summons came on Cross Enterprises' letterhead, hand-delivered by a courier who wouldn't leave until Zora signed for it. Inside was a single line: "Your presence is required at 10 a.m. Tuesday. It concerns your company. Not a request, a notice." Zora walked into the glass tower on 5th Avenue 5 minutes early, dressed in the sharpest blazer she owned, refusing to let anyone in that building see her rattled. The elevator rose 60 floors in silence, opening directly into a boardroom with a view that made the whole city look like a model set. Tiny, controllable, something you could rearrange with your hands. Kalen was already seated at the head of a long glass table, a folder in front of him, and a look on his face that told her exactly how much he was enjoying this. "Sit," he said. "I'll stand." She stayed by the door. "What is this, Mr. Cross?" "A courtesy." He slid the folder down the table the way he had that very first morning, except this time it landed with far more weight behind it. As of 8 a.m. this morning, Cross Enterprises acquired a controlling stake in Meridian Compliance Partners. Zora went very still. Meridian Compliance Partners was her firm, the independent consulting agency she'd spent a decade building from nothing, the one that let her walk into shipping terminals and textile mills and tell men like Kalen Cross exactly what he could and couldn't do. She flipped the folder open with hands that refused to shake, scanning the paperwork. Signatures, shareholder transfers, a majority stake bought out from under 3 partners who apparently hadn't thought to warn her. "You bought my company." "I bought 61% of it," Kalen corrected, leaning back in his chair. "Which means, as of this morning, I'm your largest shareholder. And as your largest shareholder, I'd like to offer you a new contract. Exclusive consulting services, Cross Enterprises only. Triple your current salary. A penthouse on Park Avenue, fully furnished, fully yours. You'd never have to worry about another client, another invoice, another sleepless night chasing down a late payment again. You think this is a gift? I think it's an opportunity most people would kill for. Most people aren't me." Zora closed the folder and set it down with more force than she intended, the glass table amplifying the sound like a gunshot. "You didn't buy an opportunity, Mr. Cross. You bought a leash. You think if you own enough of my company, I'll stop asking questions about your shipments, that I'll sign whatever you put in front of me because my mortgage depends on it. I think you're a brilliant businesswoman who deserves to be paid what she's actually worth. I think you're an arrogant tyrant who's never once in his life heard the word no and decided, instead of learning to live with it, you'd just buy the person saying it." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like a verdict. "You didn't corner me in my office. You didn't win me over on that factory floor. So you found the one lever you thought you could actually pull. Money. And you pulled it as hard as you could." For the first time since she'd met him, Kalen's composure cracked. Just slightly, a muscle working in his jaw. "You're refusing triple your salary and a Park Avenue penthouse out of pride?" "I'm refusing it, because the moment I take your money, I stop being the one person who can tell you no." Zora stepped closer to the table, close enough that he had to look up at her. "That's not pride, Mr. Cross. That's the only thing keeping either of us honest." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the hum of the building's climate control and the distant murmur of the city 60 floors below. "I could make this difficult for you," Kalen said finally, quieter now. "Majority shareholders have leverage. I could restructure the firm, force out your partners, make Meridian a subsidiary in name only. You could." Zora didn't blink. "And the moment you did, every client on our books would know exactly what Cross Enterprises does to companies it can't control outright. You'd win a shell of a firm and lose the one thing you actually seemed to want when you walked into my office 4 days ago: my respect. So go ahead, restructure it, gut it, see what's left when you're done." She watched something shift behind his eyes. Not the calculated recalibration she'd seen at their first meeting, but something closer to genuine unease. A man realizing the trap he'd built had no door he could walk through and still get what he wanted. "That's not what I want," he said. "Then undo it." Zora's voice softened by exactly 1 degree, just enough to let him hear that this wasn't only anger, it was disappointment, and disappointment cut deeper than rage ever could. Sell back the stake. Let my partners buy in again. If you want to know me, Mr. Cross, you don't get to own me first and ask permission later. He didn't answer right away. His fingers drummed once against the folder, and for a long moment she thought he might actually refuse, might let his pride win the way pride always seemed to win with men like him. "I'll have my lawyers draft the reversal by Friday," he said finally. "I'll believe it when I see the paperwork." Zora turned toward the door, pausing only when his voice caught her from behind. "You said I'd regret trying to own you." "You will," she said without turning around. "Every man who's ever tried has." She left him standing alone in that glass tower, with the whole city spread out beneath him, small and rearrangeable. And for the first time, Kalen Cross understood that the one thing in it he actually wanted couldn't be bought at any price he was used to paying. Milan, in early autumn, smelled like rain and old stone, and Zora had promised herself she'd enjoy exactly none of it. She was here for the Global Trade Expo, representing Meridian's newly independent client roster. Her partners had bought back their shares within a week of the boardroom confrontation, just as Kalen promised, and for the first time in a month, she'd allowed herself to believe he might actually be a man who kept his word. That belief was the only reason she hadn't been surprised to see Cross Enterprises listed as a keynote sponsor. She should have known better than to think a shared stage meant a shared understanding. The Palazzo del Ghiaccio glittered that evening, chandeliers throwing gold light across 300 of the industry's most powerful people, champagne circulating on silver trays, string quartet tucked into a marble alcove, playing something that sounded expensive. Zora had come for the panel on ethical supply chains. She had not come for what happened after it. Kalen found her at the edge of the ballroom, dressed in black tie that made him look less like a man and more like a rumor. "You look like you're trying to leave." "I'm trying to find the bar." She wasn't lying. Exactly. She'd spotted him from across the room 20 minutes earlier and had been quietly plotting her exit route ever since. "Stay." He said it simply, but there was something different in his voice tonight. Less command, more request, which unsettled her more than his usual certainty ever had. "There's something I want to say, here, in front of everyone." Before she could object, he was already turning toward the small raised platform where the evening speakers had addressed the crowd, taking the 2 steps up with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted a room would listen to him. A hush moved through the ballroom as heads turned. Zora felt her stomach drop. "Most of you know me as Kalen Cross," he began, voice carrying easily without a microphone, the man who inherited a fashion house and a family name that came with certain expectations. A ripple of knowing laughter, quickly hushed. "What most of you don't know is that 4 months ago, a woman half my size and twice my spine walked into my life and told me no. Then she told me no again, and somewhere in all that refusing, she became the only person I've ever wanted to hear say yes." Zora's face went hot, then cold. Every eye in the ballroom had found her now. Champagne glasses paused midair, phones already rising to capture whatever was about to happen. This wasn't a declaration. This was a performance, staged in front of the exact audience Kalen knew would matter most to her. Clients, competitors, the entire ecosystem she'd spent 15 years building a reputation inside of. He hadn't asked her. He'd cornered her, in the most public room he could find, the same way he'd cornered her in that dockyard office on day 1. "Zora Whitfield," he said, extending a hand toward her from the platform. "Would you—" "No," she said, loud enough to carry, before he could finish the sentence. The word cracked through the ballroom like a dropped glass. Kaylin's hand faltered in the air. "Zora, you just did it again." Her voice didn't shake, though her pulse was hammering hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. She stepped forward, closer to the platform, refusing to let 300 witnesses see her shrink. "You didn't ask me. You announced me. You built yourself a stage and expected me to walk onto it, because saying no in front of an audience this size would humiliate me more than it would you. That wasn't my intention. It doesn't matter what you intended, it matters what you did." She turned to face the room now, chin level, voice steady enough to reach the back wall. "Since we're being public about things tonight, let me be public about mine. 6 weeks ago, after you bought a controlling stake in my consulting firm without warning me, I stopped trusting you to play fair. So I spent those 6 weeks quietly acquiring a controlling interest of my own in Meridian Logistics Europe, the distribution hub that clears every single one of Cross Enterprises' shipments through this continent." The murmur that moved through the ballroom this time was sharper, hungrier. "As of this morning," Zora continued, pulling her phone from her clutch and turning the screen toward him, toward the room, toward every camera already recording, "I hold 63%, which means effective immediately." She tapped the screen once. Deliberately, every Cross Enterprises shipment scheduled through this hub is frozen, pending a full compliance audit, including the 11 containers currently sitting in the Genoa port that don't match their declared manifests. The same discrepancy I flagged in Newark 5 months ago, and you never actually corrected. Kaylin stood frozen on the platform, the practiced composure that had carried him through boardrooms and backrooms alike, finally, visibly cracking in front of the one audience he could never fully control. "You did this in front of everyone," he said quietly, and for the first time she heard something that sounded almost like respect, buried inside the shock. "So did you," Zora said. "I just did it better." She didn't wait for his reply. She turned, walked the length of that glittering ballroom with 300 pairs of eyes tracking her every step, and didn't look back once. Not at the platform, not at the man still standing frozen beneath the chandeliers, not at the phones still filming the moment that would be circulating through every trade publication in Europe by morning. Outside, the Milan night air was cold and sharp against her face, and only once the palazzo doors had closed behind her did Zora allow her hands to finally shake. She had won. She was almost certain of it. She had no idea, walking alone into that dark street, that freezing his port access hadn't cornered a predator at all. It had accidentally exposed exactly which parts of his empire were dirty enough to need protecting, and just how far someone else, someone far more dangerous than Kaylin Cross, was willing to go to keep that secret buried. The story broke 3 days after Milan, and it broke fast. Zora was in her Soho studio when her phone started buzzing without stopping, one notification stacking on top of another until the screen looked like static. She almost didn't open the first article. She wished, afterward, that she hadn't. Meridian founders' eco-fabric claims under fire. Independent lab results show toxic runoff levels 10 times legal limit. Her hands went cold reading it. The report cited lab data, dates, batch numbers, specific enough to feel real, specific enough that half her clients had already called before she'd finished the first paragraph. 2 had put contracts on hold. 1, a luxury house in Milan she'd fought 2 years to land, had canceled outright. She knew, within the hour, exactly who was behind it. Julian Reyes had been her business partner for 6 years before their split, back when Meridian was 2 people and a shared office above a dry cleaner's. He'd wanted to cut corners on sourcing to hit margins faster. She'd refused. He'd left angry, convinced she was sabotaging her own success out of stubbornness, and she hadn't spoken to him since. Until now, apparently, when he'd decided the best way back into the industry was to burn down what she'd built without him. She confirmed it by midnight, cross-referencing the independent lab cited in the article with a shell company registered 8 months earlier, at an address 2 blocks from Julian's new consulting office. The dates were fabricated. The batch numbers didn't correspond to any shipment Meridian had ever processed. It was sloppy if you knew where to look, but most people wouldn't look. Most people would just read the headline and believe it. She was still staring at the screen, jaw tight, when someone knocked on her studio door at 11 at night. Kalen stood in the hallway, tie loosened, looking like he hadn't slept either. "I know who did this," he said, before she'd even opened the door fully. "So do I." Zora stepped back to let him in, too exhausted to fight the fact that some part of her was relieved to see him. "Julian Reyes, my former partner. He's been circling for months, waiting for something to use against me. I have people who could make sure he never circles again." Kalen's voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the words land harder. "It wouldn't be traced back to you. It wouldn't be traced back to me. He'd simply stop being a problem you have to think about." Zora went very still. "Say that again." "You heard me. I want to hear it out loud. From you, so there's no version of tonight where you get to pretend you meant something softer." She crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "You're offering to make a man disappear because he hurt my business. I'm offering to fix something that's hurting you." Kalen took a step closer, and for once there was no performance in his face. Just something raw and certain, a man who genuinely believed this was the kindest thing he had to give her. "Zora, this is what I'm good at. This is the part of my world I usually keep away from you. But you're standing in the middle of a crisis I could end in one phone call. Let me know." The word came out immediately, sharper than she intended, and she watched it land on him like a slap. "Absolutely not. He tried to destroy everything you built, with lies, with a fake lab report, and a shell company he didn't even bother hiding well." Zora's voice rose despite herself, 3 months of careful composure finally cracking. "I can beat that in daylight, Kalen. I have the paper trail. I have the shipment records. I have 15 years of a spotless compliance history that any real journalist will find in about an hour if they actually do their job. What I don't have, what I refuse to have, is a body count attached to my name because the man I'm involved with thinks violence is a love language. I'm not talking about a body count. I'm talking about protection. You're talking about finishing with better branding." She said it flatly, watching every muscle in his face tighten. "And here's what you need to understand. Right now, standing in my studio at 11 at night, if you ever do this, if you ever make someone disappear on my behalf, without my knowledge, thinking you're protecting me, I will never speak to you again. Not out of anger, out of certainty, because I will know, for the rest of my life, that the man I let close to me solves problems with a gun instead of a courtroom, and I have spent every single day of my career trying to be the opposite of that." Silence filled the small studio, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of a siren somewhere down the block. "You'd rather lose the fight than win it my way," Kalen said finally quietly. "I'd rather win it as myself." Zora held his gaze, unflinching. "You want to help me?" Get your legal team on the phone, get me your forensic accountants, fight this with paper, the way I've fought everything else in my life. But if you ever try to fight it with fear again, you'll lose the one thing you've spent 5 months apparently trying to earn." Kalen studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Not defeat, exactly, but the slow, unfamiliar recognition of a boundary he had never once, in his entire life, been asked to respect. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay? Legal team, forensic accountants, your way." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair, looking younger and more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. "I don't know how to fight fair, Zora. I've never had to." "Then it's time you learned," she said, "because I'm not interested in a man who protects me by becoming someone I'd have to protect myself from." Boston in late October was gray and windswept, the kind of cold that got into your coat and stayed there. Zora arrived at the financial district offices of Whitcomb and Reyes, the firm Julian had partnered with after his split from Meridian, with a legal team of 3 and a folder thick enough to leave a bruise if you dropped it on your foot. She hadn't expected Kalen to be there. She should have known better. He wasn't in the conference room when she walked in, and for one unguarded moment, she felt something close to disappointment before she caught herself. Then her lead attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya Advani, leaned over and murmured, "Cross Enterprises' legal team has been on this since 6 this morning. Forensic accountants, too. They've already flagged 3 inconsistencies in the shell company's registration we hadn't caught yet. He's here? In the building. Not in this room." Priya slid a folder across the table. "He said you'd want to run this yourself. Said if he walked in, it would look like Meridian's case depended on cross muscle instead of Meridian's facts." Zora sat with that for a second longer than she meant to. It was such a small thing, staying out of a room, and yet it was the first time since she'd met Kalen Cross that he had chosen to be useful to her without needing to be seen being useful. No stage, no audience, no performance for a crowd of 300 at a chandeliered gala. Just a quiet stack of forensic paperwork that had apparently been assembled overnight by people he was paying and not once claiming credit for. The deposition itself took 4 hours. Julian sat across the table, looking thinner than she remembered, his composure fraying visibly as Priya walked through the shell company's registration date, the fabricated lab certifications, the batch numbers that corresponded to no shipment Meridian had ever processed. Each discrepancy laid out with a precision that left no room for spin. By the 3rd hour, Julian's own attorney had stopped objecting and started looking like a man calculating how fast he could withdraw from the case entirely. "The lab you cited," Priya said, sliding a document across the table, "was incorporated 11 months ago. Its registered address is a mailbox rental 2 blocks from your office, Mr. Reyes. Its listed director has no environmental science credentials of any kind. He's a part-time bartender in Cambridge. Would you like to explain that, or shall we let the retraction speak for itself?" Julian didn't answer. He just stared at the table, jaw working, the silence saying everything his lawyer wouldn't let him say out loud. By the time the deposition ended, 3 of Zora's canceled clients had already texted, having caught wind through industry back channels that the story was unraveling. It wasn't over. Retractions took time, reputations took longer to rebuild than to break. But for the first time in a week, Zora walked out of a room feeling like the ground under her feet was solid again. Kalen was waiting in the lobby, sleeves rolled up, tie gone entirely, looking like a man who'd spent the whole day working instead of performing. He didn't approach her with flowers or a grand gesture. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her cross the marble floor toward him. "How'd it go?" he asked. "You already know how it went. Your accountants found the mailbox before mine did. I wanted you to find it yourself, in the room, in front of him." A faint, tired smile. "I just made sure you had everything you needed to do it." Zora studied him for a long moment, the cold Boston light falling through the tall lobby windows. "You didn't come in. You told me a month ago that you'd rather win as yourself." He shrugged, like it had been the simplest decision in the world, though she suspected it hadn't been simple for him at all. "So I stayed out of the room. Doesn't mean I stayed out of the fight. That's the first time you've ever actually listened to something I said, instead of arguing with it. I've been practicing." He said it lightly, but there was something underneath it, something almost nervous. A man, testing a version of himself he wasn't sure yet how to wear. "I sent Julian's file to 3 industry publications this morning too, anonymously, through counsel. Figured the story that broke you should be the same story that clears you, cycle for cycle. That's smart." "I have my moments." He finally let himself look at her fully, and there it was again, that quiet fascination from the very first day, except softer now, less like a man cataloging a prize, and more like a man genuinely uncertain of his footing. "I'm not going to pretend this makes up for buying your company or ambushing you on a stage in Milan." "No," Zora agreed. "It doesn't. But it's something. It's something," she echoed, and found she meant it. She thought of every version of him she'd met so far. The man who'd corner her in her own office. The man who'd buy her company to keep her close. The man who'd stood on a platform and turned her private life into a headline. And now this one, standing quietly in a marble lobby, having spent an entire day making sure she had what she needed to win a fight without once needing to be thanked for it in public. "This doesn't mean I trust you," she said finally. "I know. It means I noticed." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold, pouring in from the revolving doors. "There's a difference. Don't confuse the two." "I won't." Kaylin held the door for her without another word, without pressing for more than she'd offered, and as they stepped out into the gray Boston afternoon together, Zora allowed herself, for the first time in 5 months, to wonder if the man walking beside her might actually be capable of becoming someone worth trusting after all. She had no idea how quickly that fragile hope was about to be tested, or how much blood it would take, 3 weeks later, in a Miami warehouse, to find out for certain. The call came at 11 at night, 3 weeks after Boston, and Zora knew before she even answered it that something had gone wrong. Federal agents just raided the Miami distribution warehouse. Priya's voice was tight, rushed, none of her usual composure intact. "Your eco-containers, Zora, the ones from the Newark contract. They're saying there's contraband inside." Zora was on a plane within 2 hours, landing in Miami just before dawn, to a scene that looked less like a customs inspection and more like a war zone. Federal vehicles lining the warehouse perimeter, floodlights cutting through the dark, agents in windbreakers moving between shipping containers with the grim efficiency of people who already knew what they'd find. She found Kaylin at the edge of the cordon, no tie, no composure, a cut above his eyebrow still seeping blood he hadn't bothered to clean. "What happened to your face?" "Hector happened." He said the name like a curse. "My lieutenant. He's been running a side operation through your containers for months, using the eco-shipment paperwork as cover because nobody double-checks a company with a spotless compliance record. I found out an hour before the raid, tried to pull the shipment, didn't move fast enough. He put contraband in my containers." Zora's voice went cold, quiet in the way that had once made grown men in boardrooms sit up straighter. "The same discrepancy I flagged in Newark 5 months ago. The one you told me you'd corrected. I thought I had. Kaylin's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something that looked almost like shame move across his face. I trusted the wrong man to actually fix it instead of just hiding it better. A federal agent approached before she could respond, flanked by two others, expressions unreadable. Ms. Whitfield, Mr. Cross, we need you both for questioning. Given the volume of product recovered and the paper trail linking these shipments to Meridian's certification. Meridian's certification is clean, Zora cut in immediately. I have 5 years of audit records that prove it. If there's contraband in those containers, it was placed there without my company's knowledge, and I want that on record right now, before this becomes a story that ends my career over something I had no part in. Noted, but until we've completed a full investigation, both companies are named parties. The agent's tone was flat, procedural, unmoved by the fear she was fighting to keep out of her voice. We'll need statements from both of you tonight. Zora felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her. Everything she'd rebuilt since the Julian scandal, every retraction, every client who'd slowly come back, all of it suddenly at risk again because of a man she'd never even met, working under a man she'd let close enough to trust. Before she could speak again, Kaylin stepped forward. It's not her company's liability, it's mine. His voice carried across the small circle of agents, steady despite the blood still drying above his eye. Hector Delgado works for Cross Enterprises. He used Meridian's shipment paperwork as cover, without her knowledge or consent. I have internal communications that prove she flagged discrepancies in this exact shipment route months ago and was assured, falsely, that they'd been resolved. I'll provide full documentation, full cooperation, and I'll accept full legal liability for what was found in those containers tonight. The lead agent studied him for a long moment. You understand what you're saying, Mr. Cross. I understand exactly what I'm saying. Kaylin didn't look at Zora, kept his eyes locked on the agent, and something in his voice had gone entirely still. Not performance, not calculation, just plain fact, delivered like a man setting something down he'd been carrying too long. This is my operation, my lieutenant, my failure to catch it in time. Ms. Whitfield's company should be released from liability immediately, in writing, tonight, and I'll sign whatever's necessary to make that happen. Zora stood frozen, watching him do the one thing she genuinely hadn't expected. Not a grand gesture built for an audience, no stage, no chandeliers, just a quiet, exhausted man at 4 a.m, trading his own protection for hers, in front of federal agents who had every reason to write his name into a case file that would follow him for years. You didn't have to do that, she said, once the agents had stepped away to confer, leaving them alone at the edge of the cordon. Yes, I did. Kaylin finally looked at her, and the exhaustion in his face was real, unguarded. Nothing like the composed man who'd once slid a folder across her desk, like he was dealing cards. You told me once that I solve problems with fear instead of accountability. Tonight, I had a choice. I could let my lawyers bury this in paperwork for 6 months, while your name got dragged through it right alongside mine, or I could stand here and actually take the weight of something I let happen under my watch. And Hector? Being processed as we speak. He won't be running anything for Cross Enterprises again. Not from a cell, and not after. Something darker moved behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. I gave the agents everything. Every account, every shipment record, every conversation where he lied to my face about cleaning up the Newark route, no disappearing acts, no phone calls in the middle of the night, just the truth, on paper, exactly the way you'd want it done. Zora studied him in the gray pre-dawn light, the warehouse floodlights throwing long shadows across the cracked asphalt. Federal agents still moving between containers behind him, and felt something shift inside her chest that she wasn't ready to name yet. Not trust, not quite, but something standing very close to its front door. "You're bleeding," she said finally, nodding at the cut above his eyebrow, her voice softer than she intended. "It'll heal. Let me look at it anyway." She reached up without waiting for permission, tilting his chin gently toward the light, and for just a moment, standing in the wreckage of a night that could have ended both their careers, neither of them said anything at all, because for the first time since a folder had landed on her desk 5 months earlier, words felt entirely unnecessary. The cut above his eyebrow needed 4 stitches, and the bruised ribs Kalen hadn't mentioned all night needed a great deal more than that. Zora found out about the ribs only when he winced climbing into the car, and by the time they reached the private medical center on the outskirts of Miami, his face had gone the pale gray of a man running on adrenaline that had finally burned through. She stayed in the waiting room through the scans, through the low murmur of doctors conferring in a language of numbers she didn't fully understand, and when a nurse finally waved her back at dawn, she found him propped up in a hospital bed, looking smaller than she'd ever seen him. No suit, no armor, just a hospital gown and an IV line, and the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent the whole night trading his own protection for someone else's. "You look terrible," she said, pulling a chair to his bedside. "You should see the other guy." A faint attempt at his old charm, undercut by the wince it cost him. "Hector's in federal custody. I don't think you fought him." "No? 2 of his men, in the loading bay, before security pulled them off me." He shifted against the pillows, jaw tight. "Cracked ribs, nothing they can't fix." Zora didn't say anything for a moment, just watched the steady beep of the monitor beside his bed, the quiet hum of machines keeping track of a man who'd spent 5 months, proving, piece by piece, that he wasn't entirely the man she'd first met in that dockyard office. She thought of the folder on her desk, the hairnet on the factory floor, the stage in Milan, the quiet forensic work in Boston nobody but her had ever known about. And now this, blood, stitches, and a confession to federal agents that could follow him for the rest of his life. "I've been thinking, lying here," Kalen said finally, his voice rougher than usual, stripped of its polish, "about what you said in your studio, about fighting fair, about not wanting a man who protects you by becoming something you'd have to protect yourself from. I remember. Hector wasn't an isolated problem, Zora. He's one piece of a network I inherited and never had the courage to actually dismantle. Because dismantling it means walking away from everything my father built. Everything that's kept Cross Enterprises armored against people who'd love to see us fall." He met her eyes, and for the first time there was no calculation in them at all, just something raw and frightened, the look of a man staring down a decision he'd been avoiding his whole life. "I want to dismantle it, all of it, the gray market shipping routes, the accounts nobody's supposed to ask about, the men like Hector who think loyalty means never asking questions. I want to hand it over. Federal prosecutors, full disclosure, whatever it costs me." Zora sat very still, letting the words settle before she let herself react to them. That's not a small thing to say, at 4 in the morning with a rib and painkillers in your system. I know. I'm saying it anyway, because I need you to hear it before it happens, not after. I don't want this to be another version of the stage in Milan, where I make a grand declaration and expect you to just accept it. A ghost of self-aware irony crossed his face. I'm telling you what I'm about to do, not asking you to applaud it. Why now? because I watched federal agents almost destroy your reputation over something you had no part in, and I realized I've spent 5 months asking you to trust a man who's still standing on top of exactly the kind of operation that put you at risk tonight." His voice cracked slightly, and he didn't try to hide it. "I don't want to be someone you have to keep protecting yourself from, Zora. I want to actually deserve whatever you've been willing to give me so far. And I don't think I can do that, while half my life is still built on things I'd have to lie to you about." Zora reached for his hand, without entirely deciding to, feeling the IV line shift slightly as her fingers closed around his. "You understand what dismantling something like that actually costs. Prison time, enemies who won't forgive you for talking, people who've protected your family for decades, turning on you the moment you become a liability instead of an asset. I understand exactly what it costs." His grip tightened around hers, weak but certain. "I've done the math 100 times tonight, lying here listening to that monitor beep. I still want to do it." "Then do it," she said it steadily, though her heart was hammering harder than she wanted to admit. "But not for me. Not because you think it's the price of earning something from me. Do it because it's the right thing. Kaylin, independent of whatever happens between us afterward. Because if I'm the reason you do this, and it ever stops feeling worth it, you'll resent me for the rest of your life." He studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his tired eyes. Surprise, maybe, that she hadn't simply accepted the gesture the way anyone else in his life would have, gratefully, without question. "You won't just take the promise," he said slowly. "Even now, even like this. Actions, Kaylin." She squeezed his hand once, gently, mindful of the IV. "You told me in Milan, you don't waste things you want. You acquire them. I need to watch you actually give something away first, freely, completely, without expecting anything in return, before I believe you've become a different kind of man than the one who walked into my office 5 months ago. And if I do, if I actually go through with it, then we'll talk," Zora said quietly, "about what comes after, once there's nothing left for either of us to prove." He didn't push further. He just held her hand a little tighter. And for the first time since that first morning at the port of Newark, Zora let herself believe, however cautiously, that the reckless promise a bruised, bleeding man made at 4 in the morning might actually turn out to be the truest thing he'd ever said to her. 6 weeks passed between the hospital room in Miami and the morning Kaylin walked into the U.S. Attorney's office in Washington, D.C. And in that time, Zora watched him become someone she barely recognized, from the man who'd once slid a rigged manifest across her desk, like he was dealing cards. He'd spent those 6 weeks in rooms she wasn't invited into, meetings with defense attorneys, quiet conversations with federal prosecutors, negotiating the terms of a cooperation agreement, long nights compiling records his father's generation had spent decades hiding. He came out of those rooms thinner each time, more tired, but never once wavering. And Zora had watched enough men make promises in hospital beds to know the difference between a vow that dissolved by morning and one that kept getting harder and holding anyway. She hadn't asked to be there for the deposition. She'd simply shown up, taken a seat in the small public gallery reserved for observers, and waited. The room was smaller than she expected. No chandeliers, no glass towers, no stage built for an audience of 300. Just a long table, a court reporter, 3 federal prosecutors, and Kaylin seated at the center of it, in a plain gray suit, no tie, hands folded in front of him, like a man finally setting down something he'd carried too long. "Mr. Cross," the lead prosecutor began, "you understand that everything you disclose today becomes part of a federal record, and that this disclosure implicates members of your own family in a pattern of activity spanning more than 2 decades. I understand. You also understand that this cooperation agreement offers you limited immunity in exchange for full and complete disclosure. But that limited immunity does not extend to obstruction, to future conduct, or to anyone else named in your testimony. I understand that as well. Kaylin's voice was steady, and Zora, watching from the gallery, recognized something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not the practiced confidence of a man used to controlling every room he entered, but something quieter and more difficult, the calm of a man who had already made peace with what today would cost him. He began with the port network, 3 decades of gray market routes threaded through Cross Enterprises' legitimate shipping contracts, disguised inside manifests that looked, on paper, exactly like the kind Zora had spent her career approving. He named accounts. He named routes. He named men his father had trusted for 30 years, men who had attended Kaylin's christening, who had stood beside him at his father's funeral, who would now, because of what he was saying in this room, face indictments of their own. Zora watched his hands as he spoke, steady on the table, no fidgeting, no reaching for the water glass beside him despite how dry his voice must have been after 2 hours of unbroken testimony. She thought of Milan, of the man who'd built himself a stage in front of 300 people because he'd wanted an audience to witness his declaration. There was no audience here that he wanted. If anything, every additional person in the room was a threat. Every prosecutor, every court reporter, every federal agent taking notes was one more person who now held power over what remained of his family's name. "Mr. Cross," the prosecutor said, near the end of the 4th hour, "you're aware that this testimony effectively dismantles the operational structure your father built. Financially, this will cost Cross Enterprises an estimated—" "I'm aware of the cost." Kaylin cut in, quiet but firm. "I did the math before I walked in here. I'll do it again after I leave. It doesn't change what I'm telling you today. And your motivation for full cooperation, given the personal and financial cost involved?" For the first time all morning, Kaylin paused. Not searching for an answer, Zora realized, but deciding how much of the true one he was willing to say out loud, on the record, in a room that would keep his words forever. "I spent most of my life believing power meant never having to answer to anyone." His voice had dropped slightly, and the room had gone very still around him. "I watched my father build an empire on that belief, and I inherited it without ever questioning whether it was worth what it cost the people underneath it, the workers on the docks, the small businesses caught in our shipping routes, the woman whose company I once tried to buy because I thought owning her would be easier than earning her trust." He didn't look toward the gallery, didn't so much as glance in Zora's direction, and she understood, watching him, that this wasn't a performance built for her benefit. It was simply the truth, finally spoken plainly, with or without an audience to witness it. "Somewhere in the last 6 months, I met someone who showed me that respect isn't something you acquire. It's something you earn, slowly, by giving away exactly the kind of power I've spent my whole life hoarding. This is me, giving it away." The prosecutor made a note, unmoved by sentiment, moving on to the next line of questioning within seconds. But in the gallery, Zora felt her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected, watching a man dismantle the only kind of power he'd ever known how to wield, in a room with no cameras, no stage, no one left to impress but himself and the truth. The deposition ran another 3 hours. By the time it ended, Kaylin looked 10 years older than he had that morning, drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the particular weight of watching your entire inheritance dissolve, sentence by sentence, into a court reporter's transcript. He found her afterward in the hallway outside the federal building, late afternoon light slanting gold through tall windows, his suit jacket slung over one arm, like he no longer had the energy to wear it properly. "It's done," he said simply. "All of it. Every account, every route, every name." "I know. I was there." "You didn't have to be." "No," Zora agreed, studying the exhausted, unguarded face of a man who had just given away everything he'd once believed made him powerful. "But you didn't have to say what you said in there either, and you did it anyway." She didn't reach for his hand this time. She didn't need to. Something had already shifted between them in that small, windowless room, quieter and more permanent than anything a stage in Milan could have staged. The difference, finally, between a man performing sacrifice and a man actually making one. 2 weeks after the plea agreement was finalized, Kalen Cross walked through the gates of the port of Newark, for the first time, as a legally cleared civilian, no bodyguards trailing behind him, no armored car waiting at the curb, just a man in a plain wool coat, hands in his pockets, standing at the edge of a shipping terminal that looked entirely different than it had 8 months earlier. Zora's operation had expanded since then. What had once been a single compliance office overlooking a busy dock was now a full logistics hub, glass and steel rising where a rusted warehouse used to stand, a sign out front reading Eco Logistics Hub, Meridian Whitfield Group, in clean, confident lettering. She'd built it from the wreckage of the Julian scandal, the Milan freeze, the Miami raid, every crisis of the last year folded into fuel instead of ash. She spotted him from her office window before he reached the front doors, and for a moment she simply watched him standing there, looking smaller against the terminal's new scale than she remembered him looking anywhere else, in any boardroom or ballroom or hospital bed. The plea deal had cost him everything the tabloids cared to count. The family shipping contracts, 2/3 of Cross Enterprises' valuation, a 5-year probationary period with federal compliance monitors permanently embedded in whatever remained of the company. What it hadn't cost him, apparently, was the instinct to show up in person instead of sending a courier. She met him on the loading dock instead of making him wait in a lobby. "You cleaned the place up," Kalen said, looking around at the terminal. Solar paneling along the roofline, electric forklifts humming instead of diesel ones, workers moving between containers without the constant undertone of anxious deference she remembered from his last 2 visits here. "I had some free time. Federal investigations tend to clear a person's calendar." She crossed her arms, though there was no real edge behind it anymore, just old habit. How's probation treating Cross Enterprises? Smaller, slower, entirely legal, for the first time in 3 generations. A faint, tired smile. "Turns out running a company without a shadow operation underneath it is a lot more boring. I'm told that's a good thing." "It is." Zora studied him, thinner than he'd been in Milan, the polish worn down to something plainer and more solid underneath, like a building stripped back to its actual foundation. "What are you doing here, Kalen?" "I came to see what's left standing." He looked past her, toward the terminal humming with quiet, competent activity, container cranes moving in smooth, practiced arcs against the gray November sky. "You built something extraordinary out of everything I put you through. I wanted to see it in person before I said what I came to say." "Which is?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder, and for a moment, old instinct made her stomach tighten, memory flashing back to a manifest slid across her desk 8 months earlier. He must have seen it in her face, because he held the folder out slowly, deliberately, giving her time to refuse it if she wanted to. "It's not a buyout," he said. "I promise you that before you open it." Zora took it carefully, flipping through pages that had nothing to do with shipping manifests or shareholder transfers. A proposal, a partnership agreement, not an acquisition, not a controlling stake, not a single clause granting Cross Enterprises leverage over Meridian's operations. 50-50, equal footing, her name listed first on every page. "I want to build the next phase of Cross Enterprises alongside you," Kaylin said, watching her read. "Legitimate freight only, full compliance, full transparency, third-party audits built into the contract from day one instead of bolted on after a federal raid forces the issue. You'd have equal say in every decision, equal ownership, and if you ever want out, there's a clean exit clause on page 11 that doesn't require my signature. You wrote an exit clause that doesn't need your permission. I told you I've been practicing." He held her gaze steadily. "This isn't a stage, Zora. There's no ballroom, no cameras, no 300 witnesses waiting to watch you say yes. It's just an offer, on paper, that you can take home and read as many times as you need to before you decide anything. I'm not asking for an answer today." Zora closed the folder slowly, looking out at the terminal she'd built from nothing twice over. Once from ambition, once from disaster, and then back at the man standing in front of her, without an entourage, without a stage, without a single lever left to pull if she said no. "You could have emailed this," she said finally. "I could have. I wanted to hand it to you myself, not because I need credit for it." A small, self-aware smile. "I know how that sounds, coming from me, but because I wanted you to see, in person, that I understand the difference now, between offering something and imposing it. And if I say no, then I'll shake your hand, wish your company continued success, and go build something smaller and slower, somewhere you don't have to think about me." His voice didn't waver, though something behind his eyes clearly hoped otherwise. "I'm not going to pretend that wouldn't cost me something, but I'm done making you pay for what I want, Zora. That's the whole point of everything that happened this year." She looked down at the folder in her hands, then back up at him, the man who'd once tried to buy her silence, then her company, then her heart on a stage built for an audience, and who now stood on her loading dock with nothing but a fair offer and the patience to let her actually consider it. "I need time," she said. "Take it." He meant it. She could hear that he meant it. "I'm not going anywhere, not this time chasing you down, just staying close enough that you know where to find me, if the answer's ever yes." He turned to leave, and this time, unlike every other departure between them, he didn't look back for a reaction, didn't wait to see if his exit would draw her forward. He simply walked back through the terminal gates the way he'd come, alone, unhurried, a man who had finally learned that the only way to actually earn something was to let it go completely. Zora stood on the dock a long time after he disappeared from sight, the folder heavy in her hands, and for the first time in 8 months, she let herself imagine what saying yes might actually look like. The launch of Whitfield Textiles, the fully independent fashion label Zora had built from the eco-fabric line she'd spent years developing, free now of every shadow contract and gray market shipment that had once threatened to swallow it, took place on the restored Pier Pavilion in Manhattan, lit end-to-end in warm gold light against a deep December sky. It was, by every measure, the night Zora had earned. 300 guests moved through a space that had once been an abandoned dock, now transformed into a showcase of everything she'd fought a year to protect. Bolts of sustainable fabric, draped like art installations, models in the first full collection her label had ever produced, without a single compromised shipment behind it. Journalists who'd once written her retraction stories, now writing features about her comeback instead. She'd sent Kalen an invitation without expecting him to use it. 6 weeks had passed since the loading dock, since the folder with the exit clause on page 11, and she still hadn't given him an answer. Not because she didn't have one, but because she'd wanted to be certain it was hers alone, made without the pressure of an audience or a deadline, or a man standing across from her waiting to hear it. She found him near the edge of the pavilion, just past 9. Not at the center of the room the way he would have positioned himself a year ago, but along the periphery, near the water, a single glass of champagne in his hand that he hadn't touched. "You came as a guest," she said, walking up beside him. "I came as exactly a guest. No board seat, no steak, no folder in my coat pocket this time." He smiled, and it reached his eyes in a way his smiles rarely had in those first few months. "I RSVP'd like everyone else. I even parked 2 blocks away because the valet line was too long." Kalen Cross, waiting in a valet line. There are worse things to get used to. He looked out at the harbor, lights from the far shore scattered across the dark water. Cross Enterprises finished its first fully compliant quarter last week. Smaller revenue than we've ever posted. Best sleep I've had in 15 years. Zora studied him in the golden light. No entourage, no performance, nothing left to prove to the room around them, because for the first time since she'd met him, he genuinely wasn't trying to prove anything at all. He'd simply shown up, the way anyone else might, hoping to be near her without demanding anything in return. "I read the proposal again last week," she said. "All the way through, twice." Something shifted in his expression. Hope, carefully restrained, the look of a man who had trained himself not to expect the thing he wanted most. "And I have questions about Clause 14. Clause 14 is standard governance language. There's nothing. I know exactly what Clause 14 says, Kalen." She smiled, and it was the first time in the entire evening she'd let herself do it fully, without the guard she'd worn like armor for a year. "I read contracts for a living. I'm stalling." "Stalling for what?" "For this part," she said, and reached for his hand, not the way she had in the hospital room, cautious and uncertain, but simply, easily, like something that no longer required deciding. "I'm saying yes, Kalen, to the partnership, 50-50, equal footing, exit clause intact, exactly the way you wrote it." He went very still, the champagne glass forgotten in his other hand. "You're sure? I spent a year watching you get torn apart. Your empire, your name, your father's entire legacy, piece by piece, in public and in private, because you finally decided some things were worth losing to become someone I could actually trust." Her grip tightened around his fingers. "I'm not saying yes because you earned it with a single grand gesture. I'm saying yes because you earned it 11 times over, quietly, when nobody was watching, when there was no stage and no audience and no reason to do the right thing, except that it was right." "I love you," he said, quiet enough that it barely carried over the low murmur of the party behind them. No platform beneath his feet, no microphone, no 300 strangers watching to validate it. "I think I've loved you since a woman in a dockyard office told me my manifest didn't add up and threw me out of her building before I'd even sat down." "I know," Zora laughed, soft and unguarded, something loosening in her chest that had been braced tight for a year. "You made it very obvious, eventually. It just took you 9 sections to actually mean it instead of performing it." 9? 9? She stepped closer, close enough that the noise of the gala faded into something distant and unimportant. The boardroom, the buyout, the ballroom in Milan. I counted. I'll do better with the next 9. You'd better. She tilted her face up toward his, the harbor lights scattering gold across the dark water behind them. A year of manifests and betrayals and hospital beds and federal depositions, finally settling into something that felt, for the first time, entirely uncomplicated. Because this time, Mr. Cross, I'm not walking away just to see if you'll follow. He kissed her then, gently, without the possessive certainty of the man who'd once told her he didn't waste things he wanted, he acquired them, kissed her instead, like a man who had finally learned the difference between owning something and being trusted to keep it. Behind them, the gala carried on, champagne circulating, the models still moving through the collection Zora had built with her own 2 hands, journalists already drafting headlines about the woman who'd rebuilt her empire from the wreckage twice and won both times. None of them noticed the 2 figures standing quietly at the edge of the pier, hand in hand, watching the harbor lights ripple across the water like something finally, fully settled. Zora Whitfield had spent a year refusing to be controlled, refusing to be bought, refusing to be silenced, and in refusing, every single time, she'd found the one man capable of finally standing beside her instead of over her. It hadn't been a fairy tale. It had been a fight, sentence by sentence, section by section, all the way to the end. And this time, when she said yes, it was entirely, unmistakably, on her own terms.